We're going to talk this morning. I'm going to turn this over to Molly Phillips, who's our Inclusion and Access Coordinator, in a few minutes. But I just wanted to do a couple of minutes of introduction about the sort of how long we've been trying to get to this survey and what our thinking was about why we wanted to do it as a network and what we hope to come out of it. I'm Marty Downs. I direct the LTR network office. Molly Phillips, who will be speaking in a few minutes, is our Inclusion and Access Coordinator. And Gabe De La Rosa, who's also on the call, is our communications person. Gabe will be sort of handling the chat and managing breakout groups on this call. So if you have any technical issues, you can reach out directly to Gabe in the chat. The LTR network and the diversity committee have been talking about a demographic survey and a climate and culture survey for quite a while. Really the last almost 4 years, maybe even a little more than 4 years now. We've struggled with that in part because interpreting the survey required knowing who we were actually reaching out to, and getting the network list sorted turned out to be a major effort. We have, I think, have done that to the extent that it's possible to do it at this point, and we're pretty excited about getting the survey out. If it went to 3,500 people across the network, so people that are either currently involved or we think have been involved in the last, the cutoff that we used was 2 years, but I think not all sites can actually delineate that clearly, so it probably extended to 3 or 4 years prior. What we hope to come out of it is some identification of where sites are really implementing successful practices in terms of creating an inclusionary environment, and identifying those practices, sharing them more broadly across the network, helping all the members of the network identify what practices would be useful in their context. One of the challenges that the network always faces is that every site has a somewhat different context. You know, some sites are embedded in well-resourced field stations that are run by their universities. That's a really different situation than, you have a field house, or you don't have any actual specific field location at all. So one of the challenges that we sort of took on in the survey was getting enough information about the context in which people were responding to make sense of the answers. And I think Molly will talk a little bit about that as we go through. What we hope to get out of this for the network are sort of what are our next steps? What are our priorities for doing inclusion and access work in the network? Should we be focusing, primarily on safety in the field? Should we be focusing primarily on engaging with Indigenous communities? And what are kind of our best opportunities to do that? Where do you all need additional resources that we can offer as a network office, given that the contexts are extraordinarily different across sites? So I think with that, I will hand it off to Molly. Maybe the next slide first, and then I'll hand it off to Molly. So goals were really to assess what do we have happening currently? Are people feeling comfortable, valued, welcomed in their work at sites? This survey focused on sites. We had a lot of debate as we developed it with the the DEI committee about whether it should focus on at the site level or the network level. And the decision was to focus primarily on the sites at this point. There was one question about how people felt with respect to the network as a whole. It was a very practical decision. People experienced the network through their sites. So most grad students probably couldn't even respond on the network level. Okay. Handing off to Molly.
All right. Thanks. Thank you, Marty, and thanks for everybody for joining. We're going to be talking about the climate survey and some kind of a sneak peek and some first look at the data. The first thing I wanted to bring note is that we had it in different sections, which included belonging, which is the feeling of security and support, and acceptance and inclusion in a certain group by a certain person. Safety is literally just the freedom from being hurt, harmed, or feeling like you're in danger or have injury or a risk of being in danger. Civility, which is treating others with dignity, respect, and making a good faith effort with regards to others' feelings. And social, which is really just the measure of how people interact and treat each other on a daily basis. So, as Marty alluded to, the survey process, it's been long coming, but it was a collaboration with the DEI committee. It started there, and then the network office. We've been helping with the facilitation and the creation of it, and it was modeled first from the ESA Ecolog survey that took place in 2020, and then also a lot of folks from the network shared existing site climate-based surveys that we took and kind of correlated and combined. We have a big focus on confidentiality for obvious reasons. We want to make sure that people feel safe sharing their experiences and don't face any repercussions, negative or otherwise. And so some of the things that we did to protect anonymity is we're identifying data is removed before we analyze. Demographics and climate survey were divorced physically, so that's why there were two surveys. And we are not going to match data with identifying information, and we're not going to be sharing raw data for that reason as well. So an overview of responses, as Marty said, we reached out to around 3,500 folks. The demographic survey had 973 responses, which equaled to about a 31% response rate. And the climate survey had around 600 responses, which equals about a 20% response rate. And so now I'm going to share a first look only. And yeah, just to remind you, we'll talk a little bit at the end about the full report and site reports, but this is just kind of our first look. So we did collect demographic information. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through the demographic data, mostly because it wasn't connected to the climate survey. We do have a few demographic questions, and that is what I'm going to focus on today. But we collected data on all these metrics, and we'll include summaries of the results in the full report. So here's our first kind of demographic type question that we asked in the climate survey, which is, what is your current and most recent role with the LTER? Investigators made up the largest proportion of respondents to the survey, which was at 34%, followed by graduate students. We separated them by supervisory role and non-supervisory role, but if you lump them, they're about 32% as well, and then followed by a smattering of various other roles across the network. Also, number of years, we asked how long folks have been with the LTER research community. 40% of respondents have been with the network between 2 to 5 years, with another large chunk being with the network for 10 years or more at 30%. The smaller groups were of really new folks, people with the network kind of like me with a year or less, and people that have been with the network for more than 5 years, but less than 10 years. So we also asked two other demographic questions. The first one was, how would you describe your gender? When we asked, 35% identified as men who took the survey, 58% as women, and 2% as non-binary. And then we also asked, do you identify with a marginalized community? We asked this question as broadly as possible to maintain anonymity. And we defined it in the survey, and I'll define it here as well, as marginalized communities are those that are excluded from dominant social, economic, educational, or cultural life. So examples of marginalized populations include, but are not limited to, groups that are excluded because of age, gender identity and expression, race, ethnicity, religion, national origin, immigration status, language, disability, sexual orientation, and socioeconomic status. Really, what we want to focus on is marginalization occurs because of an unequal power dynamic between social groups that perpetuate and sustain inequalities. So back to our results here, 30% of respondents said yes, they do identify with one marginalized community or more. 57% said no, and 6% were unsure, which also makes sense given the dynamic nature of marginalization. It really does depend on what group you're in, whether you feel like you're part of a marginalized community or not. And that will be shifting constantly. All right, so now we're going to look at some of these results, and we're going to look at it through the frame of that last question of, do you identify with a marginalized community? And once again, to protect anonymity, I created some larger buckets here to just visualize it. So I grouped all of the graduate students, both the supervisory and non-supervisory, and I also put all of the different staff categories together. But what we found, which is interesting, is that 47% of graduate students identify with a marginalized community compared with 20 and 25% of investigators and staff respectively. So back to that overall result of 34%, our graduate student population has more folks who identify with a marginalized community than would be expected. And our staff and investigators are lower than expected at the 20 and 25% mark. And then we looked at that with years, once again, in the community. And similarly, 49% of folks who identify with a marginalized community, when you look at years in the network, 49% identify with a marginalized community have been with the network for 5 or fewer years, and that drops to 24% when you look at folks that have been with the network for 5 years and beyond. So once again, it's very similar that our younger students are identifying with marginalized communities, and also the people that are newer to our network are identifying more with marginalized communities. And now into some of our like climate results. So, hopefully now that you guys get a bit of like what our network looks like and where maybe we have more diversity and where people also are having more pinch points. So we look at this general question of site policies and cultures allow me to complete my research or work while working with an LTR project. Overall, 82% of people strongly agree with the statement. But breaking it down to people who identify as a member of a marginalized group, 80% strongly agree compared with over 93% of people agree or strongly agree that do not identify as a marginalized group. So we see this pattern over and over again. And also you'll notice that only a few respondents disagree with this statement, but they were folks that identify with the marginalized group. And this is a pattern we see throughout. Here's another example of a general question about very similar. Instead of I can get my work done, this is I can maintain my well-being. And 77% of folks agree that they can maintain their well-being while working with LTR. And we see similar proportions, once again, between the folks that identify as part of a marginalized community and folks that do not. When we look at belonging, this is the measure of feeling secure and supported and a feeling of sense of acceptance and inclusion in a membership of a group. Overall, we have 80% of respondents either agree or strongly agree that they feel like welcome and valued. However, when you look at people that don't identify as belonging to a marginalized group, that percentage jumps up again to close to 94% of respondents feeling strongly agree that they feel welcomed and valued, versus 80% of folks that identify with a marginalized community. And then Similarly, this is another belonging question. I see evidence. So this isn't even about your feelings personally, but you see evidence that people of all cultures and backgrounds are valued at your LTR site. This drops a little bit more to overall 73% of respondents agree or strongly agree with this statement, but a higher proportion of respondents at 80%, 86% agree or strongly agree if they don't self-identify as marginalized. And a higher proportion at 11% disagree or strongly disagree if they do identify with a marginalized community. And we've marked this too. This is one of the areas that we think that the qualitative questions will help us identify what's happening here in this general trend. But also, it does tend to break apart between folks that identify as part of a marginalized group and people that don't. Moving on to safety. Safety is a huge concern just because of the work that we all do. We have like a huge variety of things that we're interacting with, from physical environments to local communities and weather conditions, etc. Though overall, 82% of respondents strongly agree that they feel physically safe when conducting research across the network. But breaking it down again, that number jumps up much higher to 91% for respondents that don't identify with a marginalized community. And another safety-related question is, I feel comfortable raising concerns about potentially unsafe working conditions. And this includes things like lightning, heat and cold, unreliable equipment, bullying. Overall, 80% agree or strongly agree that they feel comfortable raising concerns, versus 3% disagree and 6% feel neutrally. And once again, folks that don't identify as marginalized have a higher proportion of respondents that strongly agree at 91%. And we did also ask, given the background and issues with field safety and sexual harassment, we asked a question about sexual harassment. And we found overall 85% have not experienced or observed sexual harassment over the last 2 years at their sites. 2% overall reported that it had occurred to them, and that is 3% of women respondents and only 0.5% of the male respondents. So it is definitely something that doesn't seem to be occurring widely, but this is definitely where we'll be getting into the site-based information to see if we can find patterns in these small but troubling areas. Civility. So civility is all about how we treat each other, and that we're making best case efforts to treat each other kindly. Overall, only 60% of respondents have never experienced any demeaning comments in the past 2 years, which I think is a pretty high bar considering we're all humans. So 60% is pretty good, but 22% it's only rarely happening, 8% occasionally, and only 1% are we seeing frequent demeaning, discriminatory, inappropriate behavior. So that's all looking really great. People who identify as belonging to a marginal group, though, report a higher occasional inappropriate behaviors at 14% compared to 8%. And folks that don't identify with a marginalized group, they have occasional issues only at 6%. So once again, we're seeing this small but pretty predictable and consistent, gap between folks that self-identify as coming from a marginalized community and those that don't. And then if you've been treated unfairly at your LTR site, what was the professional stage of the person that made you feel this way? We have 40% of the people reporting being treated unfairly by the PIT, followed by other faculty and non-LTR staff, versus LTR staff is pretty far down here. So I found this figure pretty unsurprising and pretty predictable, just because of, power dynamics in most academic spaces. These are the people that have the power to treat people unfairly. I don't think it means that PIs are running around being the most unfair in the universe. I think this is a great evidence of what power dynamics, how those interplay. And then we have kind of ending on a positive, which is when we asked about social, just kind of like generally how positive are your interactions in the network. You'll see that The majority of respondents in the purple and the red are very frequently or frequently. Majority of respondents had frequent positive experiences with people showing interest and concern and courtesy and offerings of help. The only place that was slightly lower was in that public recognition of your work and accomplishments, which I think is probably a product of the way academia tends to acknowledge work through authorship of publications only, which can often lead, support staff, technicians, volunteers, and students feeling like not as, like their work isn't being publicly recognized as much. And then when we move into the qualitative responses, I have these two quotes here because I felt like really kind of hit at the two most common responses that we got, which was the LTR culture is the best research culture I've experienced during my career, which doesn't mean that it can't be improved, but I think that's a really great thing to hear, that folks are having more positive experiences when working with LTR than on average in their academic lifespans. That's great. And then also we have this general comment that the LTR community still feels hard to get into, a little exclusive. So basically still getting into that, like how do we, become more welcoming, get more folks involved, which is, I feel like the call for any large network such as this to find a way to make sure that they're inviting new people in. And then this general themes and the suggestions were many folks talked about mandatory trainings, especially for PI leadership teams, better recruitment efforts to increase diversity, improving opportunities for undergraduate research was mentioned many times, along with having written protocols and rules that are followed by everyone, and also physical accommodations and equipment being an important piece. So my general takeaways from this quick look are that the results were largely positive. Like this, as someone who's done several of these larger climate surveys, this data shows to me that this is a largely positive, encouraging network. But whether you identify as someone from a marginalized group, that impacts how you experience the LTR, which makes a lot of sense. We also see with the fact that a lot of the folks that are identifying marginalized communities, our diversity is coming from our graduate students, our undergraduate students, our folks coming in. So recruitment is an incredibly important tool to increase diversity in the network. But I think the rest of these findings show that we also need to focus on retention, and especially for people who identify with marginalized communities, being more intentional with creating spaces that are inclusive for folks that are already coming feeling like they don't belong or feeling a little bit of that imposter syndrome. So with that, our next steps are we're going to create a full report of both survey results and share them at the end of the year. And I have office hours, so I'll definitely, once the report goes out, I will be asking folks if they want to come. Anybody, graduate student, volunteer, PI, anyone can come and talk to us about the report and during those office hours. And then we will also be creating site-based reports at the very beginning of next year. And I'll also be making myself available and reaching out to site leadership to go over results of the individual site reports. And then next steps for DEI, as Marty said, we created this to see where we're at and where we should be going. I think especially when we see this breakdown of folks that are new to the network, feeling a little bit less secure, that mentoring support is a really great place to start. Mentoring our mentors, mentoring our PIs and our support staff through the workshops and community practice. And then we'll also be curating resources and tools for the network that are led based on this climate report. So field safety and mental health toolkits and interpersonal conflict resolution toolkits are on their way. as well as a new DEI resources searchable database in general, hoping to make the DEI resources page that the office and the committee have already created, and it's amazing, just a little bit more searchable and usable for everybody. And then also continuing those field safety trainings throughout with partnerships like the Field Futures program. And this will also be where I'm going to put a plug. If this has made you excited and you want to learn more and get more involved in DEI in the LTR community, I would highly encourage you join the DEI committee, which is very active and filled with great ideas and great momentum. So it's just a great space to be in. All right. So that is my general overview. We were thinking about next jumping into breakouts. I don't know, Marty, if you wanted to do general questions or breakouts first.
Yeah, I think maybe we'll take a few minutes for general questions first.
Sure. Maybe I'll stop sharing so I can see folks.
Yeah.